Yes, here you go. Uh, Hello, Jean-Luc. Hello,
Hello.
hello, everybody joining the call. Welcome to the Value Talks from BCL. This is our first episode from the Value Talks to manage and to produce in 2022 concerning a very important topic in digital innovation, which is the machine workforce and the impact it has on the different aspects of business, including the human or people workforce. First, I would like to welcome Mr. Jean-Luc, our guest speaker for today. Jean-Luc is the European representative of VCL, and also he is recognized as a marketing and sales expert, certified professional coach, and also has a master in mind mapping. Correct me if I'm wrong in anything, Jean-Luc, or if you have to need to add anything to this.
You've got a lot of good informations actually there, and I would say I was also part of the founding members of TTM and VCL, so that puts me back to a long history in that sense, and
Yes.
really pleased to be with you today.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us. Okay, as we explained in the topic of today, we will be tackling the part of machine workforce and its relevance to digital innovation. So let's go ahead with the first part of today's conversation, which is related to, as I said, the relevance between the machine workforce and also digital innovation, and how digital innovation in specific impacts the rise of machine workforce. Yes, Jean-Luc, yes. What do you think of this? The impact or the relevance between the machine workforce and digital innovations, and also the impact or the how rapidly it's taking place, the machine workforce, I mean.
It's quite an interesting question because when you talk about digital innovation, change, and a certain number of things, what you really have to do is you have to kind of go back in history a little bit and see whether this innovation or this change is different from other ones. And I'll take you back to one of the major changes that happened to humanity, and this is about 200,000 years ago, and it was actually the introduction of fire. And
Mm,
introducing fire to humanity made something possible, which is the digestion of meat. And that alone made a big change to humanity because it allowed actually to settle from chasing only animals to a movement where you could actually store some food and digest much better some food, take much less energy for that one, and actually put this energy in the brain. So the first change that happened to humanity is a change where our brain all of a sudden had a chance to use more energy. So this was a positive change. The second biggest change was agriculture, when this allowed actually for cities to create, for cities to being fed, and people to be able to live in a more steady way. That was about 70,000 years ago.
yes.
Then the next change happened probably in and around 1850. So you see 17,000 years, and then probably not a lot of things happened. And then one of 1850 is what's called the Industrial Revolution, where for the first time you have actually a certain number of tools that will be actually replacing manpower, human or animal manpower. That has an important impact on Western Europe and then on the rest of the world. But something subtle happens at the same time, and that's at the political level, because one of a sudden, before that, you had kings, queens, and other rulers actually owing some humans. But actually, with the Industrial Revolution comes in what's now called capitalism, And capitalism actually will also steer a second element on this one, which is the combination of workforce that is not working anymore for eating, but for a salary dependent on a system. So that's something which takes us to 1850, 1870, and it continues until probably the beginning of the 80s of the last century, 1980, when actually the real history meets actually my story. And in 1980, I just finished my studies as an engineer, and I had studied for 5 years plus 3 years, 7 years in total. I had studied actually industrial drawing, mechanical drawing. And when I
mm,
start to work in 1980, personal computers are there, and personal computers are able to do computer aided design. And in
mm,
fact, 50% of the work I had learned disappeared one of a sudden. My job, not my job, but the job of a lot of people that worked with me at school was gone,
mm,
replaced by computers. And now you could start to say, so digital is replacing a workforce. The people that were doing the drawings, that were doing actually the whole work was replaced by plotters, by computers. All these people lost their jobs. No, they actually got a much more interesting job, which was to do a lot of the calculations that could not be done before with those mini computers they could use at that time. So we see something happening at that point, which is the technology that's coming in, the digital technology that's coming in, changes the behavior of the workforce, changes the way the workforce is actually doing it. So we'll see it later on because I know there is other elements, which is some jobs will always disappear when you're actually going into another stage of evolution. You can
mm,
call it revolution, but sometimes those jobs actually will just change the way people behave, change the way people are actually going to learn elements in that sense. So that's beginning of the 80s was the first digital revolution. But after that, um, there are other revolutions that will change the way people communicate within actually the elements. And the next big change is actually in the year 2000 was the introduction of mobile phones and mobile communications. And then what we know now, which is the social networking, which also has an impact on the intercultural and the intergenerational activities. So there are lots of impacts, and obviously there are always people that see it from one side and from the other side, and will say humans are not designed for one or the other, or humans are designed for one of the others. But that's one of the topics we can then talk about later on, which is, do we actually have the capability to adapt ourselves to those changes? And obviously the answer is yes, but the question is, how does this work and how can we actually foster it? There
yes.
was a long statement actually for your question, Shadi, but I believe it had to be that introduction to put it into perspective.
That's very good. That's very good. And thank you for walking us through the journey from the early centuries until up to the moment. And also the flow you took from the third industrial revolution to the fourth one and the digital transformation or transition happening from this revolution to the next one. That leads us to the next part of the conversation, Jean-Luc, which is the complexity of the level of complexity that the machine workforce is taking and adding to the nature of jobs that's being replaced by machine workforce. If you can tell us how you perceive and also the market, how it's changing concerning these in terms of complexity in specific.
It's it's always a people are always scared when they see new technologies coming in and believing people cannot do it. I'm talking here from our Strasbourg office, and recently we had some works happening outside. And when you actually look at construction works, that's a very good example of how the world has changed in the last 20 years. And I'll come back to those 20 years in a minute. But I had three people working on the extension of our offices here. And when in the past you actually had to call a guy to do the measurements and the leveling, etc., the employees would do that themselves because they would actually have a small box, which is a laser structured leveling device that they could use on their own. And obviously, these people that were actually masons, people that used to actually use just their simple tools, very quickly could learn the usage of that very intelligent and electronic and digital device, but it actually made their life easier and they understood it and they started to use it, which means that you could have more workplaces happening at the same time than before with less people and being more affordable. So even in small things like masonry, there is a digital revolution that makes a change. But what I said is 20 years. And sometimes in a short term, and this is the case also for the current digital revolution, if you want, there are impacting changes because the next generation of people is not ready to actually cope with it. So there is always about half to three quarters of a generation time between the introduction of a technology and its implication into the rest of the world. And the secret behind this is not genetics, but it's something that I called mimetics.
mm,
Mimetics, the word doesn't really exist, but it's actually coming from the concept of memes. Memes is something that internet people, younger people being in internet, use in the wrong way, I would say, because it's actually internet memes and it's copying, etc. But a meme is a concept which has actually been drafted by Richard Dawkins in the 80s, and it's a parallel, or it's actually a companion to genetics. Genetics, we all know that our species, the human species, has evolved over the centuries and the millennials that are behind us with small changes in our genetics. We've been adapting. That's Darwin. But
mm,
Darwin actually also understood a second element, which is there are short-term changes that actually happen over the time of a generation or less. And that's due to not genes, but memes. And memes means that a social group or a social organization will lead into changes which are copies of elements that the rest of the clan is doing. But this is not new. When first fire was invented, people were copying the fact to make fire. They didn't get courses on how to make fire. They were looking at people. So a meme is actually defined by three things. First of all, there is a longevity. The tradition that's introduced works over time. Different generations, different type of people can do it. The second element is it is not something which is alone. It can create other memes from that original memes, if you want. There is longevity plus the fact that it can construct further on. And the
mm,
third element is there is a certain fidelity in copying it. People replicate the same things. That's how behaviors in Facebook have invented itself. That's how behaviors in Instagram have invented itself, and in return have changed the way what we call now the millennials have actually started to communicate and to work. I'm going to
mm,
give you an example how digital elements can change the face of the world. I'm very much specialized in healthcare. And I was working just before COVID time, actually, on OCT, that's called optical coherence technology. And what it is, it's a way to look in your heart and to look inside of your heart and to see pictures from the inside of your coronary arteries. Now, it's quite new, and not a lot of physicians actually are cardiologists are actually understanding what's going on really in that sense. What happened is I was in one of the operating rooms standing next to a physician, and we were looking at a picture from the inside of the heart of a patient. And he looks at me and says, what do you think? Do you think this is calcification or this is actually a lipidic a structure? And I said, honestly, I don't know. He says, give me a minute. And what he does, he picks actually up his phone, turns it on, puts on WhatsApp and says, hey, Mike, can you have a look at this picture? Turns around the phone and says, have a look at the picture. He shows him the screen and says, what do you see there? Now, that element where a leading cardiologist in an operating room, when there are 5 or 6 people looking at him, looks and gives away the fact that he does not know what is happening and that he asks a colleague of his using a technology like this one is not only new because it's possible, but it's also new because he's doing this and he's not anymore turning around to his master or to his key opinion leader to make up his mind, but he's asking his peers. That's how technology introduces the technology of being able to communicate introduces actually changes in the way people behave. But that change does not happen overnight. It has something to do with humans, and we are talking about probably something like half a generation, 10 to 15 years before those changes take place. And that's probably one of the big elements that scare people these days, which is the changes we've been talking about before: tools, fire, agriculture, from 1850 to 1980. These are all long times with multiple generations of humans going over. The
Mm.
problem we have is that actually today the changes is going much quicker, meaning actually that we humans have to adapt much faster than before, and we're not designed for that. And that's why actually when it comes to companies, when it comes actually to business, we've got to be cautious about that and not pull the trigger too fast, not encourage those changes too fast, because we have still to think about the fact that we have generations at work, and these generations at work sometimes are problems. And we know this at VCL and at TTM, that some of the major changes we have to deal with due to the digital revolution is also the intergenerational revolution that we have to deal with the millennials, the Gen Zs, and the boomers like me, which really have very, very different ways of looking at the working time. So that's the second element, which I think is important. Digital revolution is emerging, but what is really new is the pace of change and the way we have to adapt to the pace of change. Probably.
That's very good. That's very good. I like it how you linked your past experiences with the currently in discussion the machine workforce and the impact on people and also the workplace. But before moving from this, Jean-Luc, you mentioned the changes that has been happening along the past 20 years. In your perspective, how you perceive these changes and also its impact on the coming 10 years, for example?
Yeah. That's always a very difficult question, because when you try to forecast the future, it's probably one of the most difficult things to do. And I could quote a lot of people having said that it's almost impossible. Um, the only thing you can do is you can look at what happened in the past and how actually some of the changes happens. And I'm going to have to talk about two things. My brother in business, which is Dr. Magdi, always says whenever you do a talk, never talk about religion and never talk about politics. I'm going to do both, which is I think going to be important, because first of all, whatever religion you're looking at, there are always driving forces that allow you to regulate the social aspects of a community. And one of the things that I see happening these days is there has been for the last 20 years probably a decline in some of those regulating forces, which is probably going to put back the spirituality side, the regulating side of different religions, whatever they are. I mean, that doesn't really matter. What matters really is that there is a need, there is a demand actually for, because of the digitalization, because of the workforce that becomes much more automated, if you want, the need for more spirituality. So there is currently going to be this one. The second trend I see happening in the next 20 years, due to probably two things. One is the fact that we have this real concern about our planet, this real concern about making sure that what we do is going to be better for younger people like you, Shady, and to make sure that your kids can be actually living in a planet that makes sense. So there is probably going to be a move away from what Karl Marx called capitalism, which was the power of decision and the power of giving money uh, from one person to many, back to what we had probably in the Middle Ages. And this is not negative what I'm saying here. And if I go back to one of the great thinkers of the Middle East, which is Ibn Khaldun really explained clearly that what worked best was the combination of leaders, and leaders using actually their people, the group, the herd, to work together. That's nothing else than socialism, where there is one boss working together in a smaller group and sharing all the resources, but also sharing the decisions and sharing the learning. And I think that's probably the biggest hope that's going to happen, whatever political form this is going to take. Uh, but it's going to be the fact that smaller groups within a huge interconnect community will be able to cope much better with changes and digital connections than big systems that are actually bound to disappear one way or the other. Um, there are thousands of examples where it doesn't work anymore, and the most recent one is the Ukrainian-Russian conflict, which really shows the old world disappearing. Why? Because you can actually see that on one side you have a old-fashioned, old-structured country, if you want, being actually opposed to a very flexible, more modern, and more interconnected element. So you see the positive impacts on these ones, and probably the end result of this conflict will be major on the Russian side, as well as they will be major on the Ukrainian side and on the rest of the world. So there are a certain number of restructuring elements that will happen out of our control. Uh, but one thing is sure. I mean, we very often use this terminology of a VUCA world, where the V stands for volatile, and the U stands for uncertainty. And the uncertainty is never going to go away in the next 20 years. But what is probably going to be the power or the element that will fuel what's happening is, I believe, the faith in humanity, and the fact that humankind can adapt to its environment, because I think everybody has understood now, and especially your generation, Shadi, has understood that if you guys don't do something, the screw up that we boomer have been doing, probably because we thought it was the right thing to do, is not going to happen. So I believe we're at the turn where everyone is actually going to go in a direction where, yes, it's important that you can actually use digital workforce, but in a way to actually provide real value added. So, for example, if you take a pick and a human person using that pick, he produces some value. But if you give that person an electrical drill, he will produce better value, quicker value, and he can do other stuff.
Hmm.
And I believe that image is probably what's going to be happening on one side. The other side is technology will bring knowledge. And I have two personal examples to share with you. I was working on one project with a French energy company, and we were actually working together with an NGO that's called Barefoot College. And Barefoot College is based in Rajasthan. And what they do is they actually train people to build digital devices to produce energy with solar energy.
Hmm.
And we were working on a project where in a village in Amazonia, we actually would make those people, and the Amazonia forest is very deep, so there is no light coming in there. And just by the sheer fact of training the people to build themselves a small 120 watt solar panel and then use this panel to produce light, the impact was that one, you could actually produce light, meaning reading, meaning actually acquiring knowledge. You could connect, secondly, actually a USB charger. Therefore, you could put some connections in place and you could actually get some contact to internet, uh, increasing the knowledge of the people, which means actually from a village that was completely illiterate, by the sheer point that you could train some people to produce light and energy, you could actually foster education. And that means probably in 20 years from now, that part of the Amazonia will never be deforested because the people will understand and will understand what their environment and what their ecology is in that point. The second example is using non-technology, but it's in the Philippines and it's a little bit older. It's about 10 years ago, where another NGO introduced the fact to use plastic bottles put in the top roofs of slums and to bring in energy, which again allowed education. So one of the biggest points here is to say is digital workforce and um, the emerging machine workforce will allow humanity to learn. And by allowing humanity to learn, we will actually increase the knowledge and the total capabilities of humanity much more than ever before. So the future revolution or the current revolution is not a revolution, is not a digital revolution. It's not a machine workforce revolution. It's a revolution in learning and in education. And that is an incredible and strong positive message for the future.
Very good. Following the same topic, Jean-Luc, now we talked about the impact of digital or machine workforce on the business and people as well inside the business. How do you evaluate the same impact on consumers which are relevant to business? When a company like VCL or TTM Associates roll out a certain solution or a service, we have an impact from the machine workforce on our own business and how we manage operations internally, and also how people perceive the business and the brand. So, in your perspective, how you evaluate this impact on people and consumers that receive the actual service or solution?
Well, probably if you had me ask the question 20 years ago, I would have said, well, we need probably to do some market research and some elements and some questioning there. Today, it's quite different. You actually get your feedback almost immediately. Why? Because of the development of the the easiest way to talk to people, which are globally called social networks. But what it really means is the following: is in the past, and if I take, for example, medical as an example, if you wanted to know what a consumer, what a patient thought about something, you had to kind of go see doctors, talk to them, etc. Today, every single uh, patient group, because there are patient groups in dialysis, there are patient groups in cardiology, there are patient groups in oncology. Uh, you can actually look at those groups very quickly, and any company being in that business has a very direct contact to its potential customers, which sometimes are also the potential workforce, if you want. And I think the marketeers of today have a much easier work than the marketeers of the 50s or of the 60s, because they have a direct contact to the people they are talking to through digital networks. But what this means is that the company that are around there need to make a transformation in their processes and to integrate those ways and those media of communication to their common practice. What it also means, and that's going to be a very important point, it also means that they need to change their management structures.
Hmm.
My first company I worked for was a company that is a tradition, if you want, in the computer business, because it's Hewlett Packard, and its name is called Hewlett Packard because it was founded by Bill Hewlett and Dave Packard. And I was lucky enough, or old enough, whatever you look at, to have met both of them. Um, and they created their companies in the 40s, roughly. And I must say they have invented a lot of leadership approaches, but almost by on the job. They didn't have courses from Harvard or from Stanford to know what to do. They just invented them on the job. Um, Fostering communication, fostering binding. But what they did outmost was they created in their 130,000 big company the spirit of family, although they were not a family, but they made sure that there were actually coffee breaks every day, mandatory coffee breaks, that there were actually twice or three times a year a barbecue with the family, integrating the family. When you actually created a meeting, a people meeting, you made sure that you sent some flowers to the spouses because you took them away for 2 or 3 days. That spirit that was put in place in the late 50s, if you want, from that point of view, for a generation that was my generation and even the generation before, needs to happen again in 2020 in a different way, of course, adapted to the Gen Zs that are coming up that work there. And Gen Zs are not married to their company. They are not married to even one company. They're going to change. Um, some people in the US call it now geekology, where you actually move from company to company every 2 or 3 years, because what's interesting is the change, etc. That needs to be integrated. You cannot create a spirit of people working 30 years in the same company, staying there and growing up the ladder of elements there. You need to create really a community of people where they can share their own human values and exchange those elements. And I think my message is always the same to HR departments. You have to make your own revolution. Job design as it was before is not going to work anymore. What you need to do is you need to be able to ready to understand as a service provider inside of your company, you need to be able to understand what drives the people to work for you. What drives the people to do the job you want them to do? What makes it attractive to the people that will work for you? And then you need to provide that. As a matter of fact, money is never going to be the first driver for Gen Zs and even to millennials. The attractiveness of the job, the value they can bring to first the company, no, to first to themselves,
Themselves.
then to the society, and then finally maybe to the company. This is going to make a very big difference. And that's the essence of the digital revolution, because The digital revolution brings tools, brings an automated workforce where it is. The question is always, what do you do with the time you win through automation, through digitalization? And if it's not for the better of the people that work there, it's not going to fly. And you can just hear what I said. It's for the better of the people working in the company. We're getting closer again to a socialist concept where there is a sharing of values internally versus actually making sure that you increase profits. I believe that's one of the big changes that's going to happen. Profits are important because they drive actually the development of a company.
Mm.
Um, but the overcapitalization we've been actually looking at in the past is probably too much, and that's going to be one of the changes. But for HR, one of the important things is I could almost paraphrase Kennedy by saying, don't ask yourself uh, what the company can provide you, ask yourself what you could provide the company. I think that concept is changing.
Mm.
And companies need really to think about today, what can we provide those people to work for us? And the for us is probably wrong also because you probably need to say with
What
us,
what is?
which I believe is going to be the big change in that sense.
Yes, very good. You also mentioned a very important part, which is the job design in a
Mhm.
specific from the HR side. But if we can go deeper into this topic of designing the job and also the prerequisites for people to hold on a specific job in an organization, and also the roles and responsibility, how these elements of the job can be designed from the HR side in relevance to the digital innovation and the revolution we are experiencing that
Yeah.
moment.
Uh, I think everything goes in parallel. If you look in the yeah, Second World War, a lot of project management tools were invented because you needed to go fast and to develop new technologies. I mean, everybody knows that, for example, the typical Gantt chart and the PERT design was invented to build missiles, for example, and quickly and very efficiently. Um, Today the world is changing, and one of the things that has been used in the last 20 years is project management based more on a scrum basis and on a very adaptive way of looking at things. I think that's also what's going to impact the job design. We used to come from a place where we would actually design very rigid job descriptions, job responsibilities, and put people in boxes and organize those boxes so that the connections could work, and even work on processes that would work on there. And the process management, the business engineering concept of the 80s, which was actually coming from a very nice movement where it went from the States to Japan and from Japan back to the States, and the optimization of the internal processes was adapted to the technologies of that time. Today, the key word is agility and flexibility, which means you don't have to design your job profiles. What you need to design is organizations that are able to define job profiles on the spot, ad hoc, when needed. So what you really need to do is you need to deprocessize your companies. You need to flex, put agility into the system, and to make sure that at every single point of time, you can react to the market demand in the right way. In my country today, there are two big food scandals. One was Ferrero, and the other one was Nestle, and one of its brands called Buitoni. And it's absolutely funny because they are in really deep yogurt, if you want, from a communication point of view, in both cases, just because they forgot the three key elements of brand management: flexibility, agility, transparency, and honesty. That's four, actually. Uh, and the point here is that they are trying to deal with their problems with technologies and behaviors from the 80s.
mm,
Today, you are at the level of a world that is communicating on a day by day basis. And therefore, my message to job design, to job structuring is keep it as flexible as possible, keep it as agile as possible, but work on one element which is going to be fundamental, and that's transparency and honesty. And make sure that both of those elements are always there, that you really tell people what's going on, because that's fundamental, I believe, in that sense. So uh, the job is not going to be easier for HR people.
mm,
It's not going to be easier, and it's not going to be more difficult at the same time. It's going to be very different. And every single thing you saw in the 80s or in the 90s won't work in the 20s of this century. And I think there's no need to redesign elements, but there is a need to listen to the younger generation. And that's probably my message as a boomer, if you want to say, which is to say, in the past, the old guys knew better than the younger guys. In the past, the wise men knew more than the younger man. In the past, uh, Yoda from Star Wars knew more than the young
oh, yeah.
neophyte.
Mm,
I think that paradigm is inversing. That paradigm is changing very strongly. And I think our collective intelligence is the right answer. And here we are back to a brilliant thought of the Middle East, which has been forgotten many centuries probably. And it's the belief I'm not so good in Arabic, but I think you call it majlis. The fact that a leader or a responsible, or call it a manager, doesn't have the almighty wisdom. His wisdom comes from the shared knowledge of the team, of the people sitting around there. And I would even say that the future of digital technology is a concept that, if I use the Arabic word al-shura, sharing the knowledge, is probably going to be one of the key elements that will make a difference there. And to be a little bit more provocative, actually, I would uh, recommend the people that listen to us and watch us to check out an old Arabic word for its real meaning,
mm.
asabiya. And
That's
asabiya today has a lot of bad meanings, but the real original root meaning meant
that's good.
sharing knowledge, spirit, and sticking together as a group and reacting together as a group. And I think that is really the element that's going to make us be able to use the digital innovation. And I would even say it's like going back to this first camp where somebody invented the fact to make fire, and he started to share it with the rest of the team. That was a sabia. And the fact that not only they would keep it for themselves, but they would share it with other tribes. I think that's probably what the future of digital technology is going to be. It's going to change completely the way we looked at the structures we had in the past won't work anymore. And it's really going to be a much more sharing of resources, sharing of knowledge, education that's going to be creating our future world. I
Okay,
guess
very
so.
good. Having this change in approach of job design, and also how we approach the market, and from the business side, and how consumers and the people perceive the change in approach from businesses. Also, how this impacts the workforce, the human workforce, to scale up their knowledge and skill set to cope with that change.
I think that's a very good question. And the answer is, let's do it like our ancestors did it. Sounds a bit strange, but it goes completely against a certain number of tools that have been invented in the last 20 to 30 years, online learning and some other things. Um, when I when I first actually joined my engineering school, the reason why my school was created is because we wanted to. I mean, the school was created in 1960 because after the Second World War, industry had to be pushed very quickly. Um, the point was at that time that you would actually use schools to teach elements to people. But that's not the normal human way of learning. Remember what I said earlier on. The normal human way of learning is through memes, through
Mm,
replication, through copying, through mastering, using actually masters helping you to understand what's happening, to learning into teams, to copying what's happening. And I think that's really what's going to happen in the learning of the future, where the design programs will involve many, many more people doing things together to learn to do it together as they progress. And one of the best examples of this, online examples of this, is actually the online MBA program that was actually designed by Seth Godin, and he actually designed this MBA program, which is a non-MBA program, where people work on projects and learn through projects. And I believe, obviously, you need to have a basic knowledge element in that sense. You need to work on ground elements, like you need to be able to read, to write, to do the maths, etc., etc. But as soon as you're actually equipped with the basic knowledge skills that you have, which will be much more possible online because you can access to it. um, Let me diverge a little minute. Since 3 months now, in uh, the other part of the office, which is actually our own home, we have four displaced people from Ukraine actually living with us. And
mm,
the two children that are there have, of course, had a chance to go to the French school. I'm in France here. But at the
mm,
same time, they still were in contact with their teachers in Ukraine. So, in a unique way, they've been displaced for the last 3 months, and with the exception of the 6 weeks where they were actually in caves, in cellars, protecting themselves from bombs, they could actually continue to learn. This is unique. This is unique because those children are actually developing themselves as if they would be home. And on top of that, they're adding some other additional knowledge, which is the French language and the French culture. And probably in 2 or 3 weeks from now, they're going to return home, and they're going to return home with a lot more knowledge due to this digital connection, due to the fact that they're not completely away from there. And I believe that's what we need to work for, which is to make sure that on one side, we create internally in the companies enough knowledge and enough time for sharing that information. When I started first at Hewlett Packard, there was one manager for 6 people. And
mm,
the role of the manager was not to be actually telling people what to do. He was like a Jedi training his Padawans.
mm,
We need to go back to this. I mean, maybe a good way is to go back and look at Star Wars and understand how this model was working. But it's really about creating small working groups within the company, led by in Latin, you would call him a primus inter pares. He doesn't have to be a manager, but he knows more than the others and he shares that knowledge. And by sharing the knowledge, by using this concept of al shura, you actually will make sure that the people will develop themselves in the company, and be able to take the time to also enjoy other things that only work. Because I believe probably the next generations will not spend all their lives like me or like Dr. Magdi to think about their company, and probably having even a hard time to think about retiring, because that's a point. So I think uh, the role of HR is really going to make sure with management that the structure of the companies will be small social networks within the company, and the boundaries, and especially those elements we've been working since a long time, which are the big cathedrals, the big verticalizations of elements are probably not what we want to look at. We want to look at elements where we have interchange of people, small working groups, very agile, very flexible, and being able to change quickly what's happening. I think so. That's at least what's going to happen.
Yes, yes, very good. Before having our last question for this session, Jean-Luc, I'm encouraging people in the call to raise their questions if they have any in the chat, and we'll be answering the questions very soon during the call or even after the call. My last question, Jean-Luc, is that if we talk to the management or the business managers within the same topic of machine workforce and the impact, the different impacts on the different aspects of business, including the consumers, what they can do or change in their behavior and how they manage business to cope as well with the changes happening in the era of the digital revolution, and also the machine workforce is taking place some other jobs in their organizations.
Well, probably because I look at the time and I think we're getting close to somehow a conclusion of that one. I would probably go back to the middle age of the Gulf, and I'm going to go back to Said Ibn Khaldun that I mentioned before, and I'm going to give him actually the answer to your question, because I believe what was true at that time is still true today. Uh, the manager or the leader of today, the first role he needs to have is, with the honesty and the transparency he must have, his role is to indicate the direction in which the group needs to go. And whether this is actually a small objective for a small work group or it's the whole company objective, but he needs to share the direction. In other words, he needs to explain the why are we doing this? Why are we in business? Why do we do that? What is it that's behind it? Then the next step, his Ibn Khaldun said, is the concept of al-shura. What is important is the collective intelligence. The fact that at every single time, all the members of the organization need to share their knowledge of the situation, their knowledge of what's happening, including, of course, the boss. That means, again, transparency and honesty for everyone, and rewarding this. Rewarding and making sure, because collective intelligence, we traditionally say 1 plus 1 doesn't equal 2, but more than 2. Well, when you actually say collective intelligence and al-shura, it actually means in an organization like how I could envision it actually, it means a much empowered knowledge, because all this knowledge concatenated is quite important.
Hmm.
Point number 3 is, one of the things actually a manager today needs to do is, and it's probably his own role, is to make sure that he actually fosters the charting of the way. He fosters the how we will do this, making sure that using the knowledge and the power of the different people in the organization together, he leads the construction of a plan and he controls the construction of that plan. So
Hmm.
number one is he needs to have a vision. Number two, he needs to make sure and to foster the exchange of the communication and the knowledge in the group al shura. The third element is together, but under the lead of the manager, we design the way, we chart the element, and that's all the techniques that you've heard of, which is agile, daily management, scrubbing method, etc. The final element, which is going to make all the difference, is actually to lead from within, or as Ibn Khaldun would have put it, lead like a shepherd. A shepherd is always with the flock. He takes care of the people. When he moves, the flock moves. He knows where to go. But if there is an advert element happening, the shepherd will take care of those that are actually outside of the flock, that need support, and the rest of the team is actually taking care of themselves while the shepherd is out there. So those four elements, coming back from 1534, I would guess something like that. And for those of you that read Arabic, I would encourage them to actually read Al Muqaddimah, because Muqaddimah is really an important management book that you can actually look at. For the others, it has been translated in many different languages. But those four elements are actually key management skills that will actually allow people to much better support the digital changes that are ahead of us, and also to make sure that you can take power of it. And by the way, these four elements that I've actually done exist in a very modern fashion, which is called the whole brain management system. And that's something which TTM and VCL are actually using in their consulting elements to make sure that we can help organizations, because it was not only Ibn Khaldun, but actually a gentleman called Ned Herman actually redesigned that. And within TTM and VCL, we've pushed further that model to work on that one. So just to repeat it, another one, have a vision, share your knowledge, make sure you have a plan, and lead from within are the four key elements to make sure that you can master a digital revolution or any sort of change that you want.
Very good. Very good. And thank you for these answers to the topics we raised today. And before we hang up the call, if you allow me, I have a question concerning part I noticed in what you offer at Jean-Luc, which is you're the inventor of a concept called cheerleadership, if I can recall it right. So if you can just give us and the audience a brief on this, that would be great.
Well, cheerleadership is a word that we've invented at one point of time. When we actually looked back in history, my history, and in the 80s, we were working for. At that time, they were called startups, but Hewlett Packard was one of them. Dell Computers was another one, and we didn't have people having a burnout. Today, a lot of people talk about burnout, depression, and stress and elements. And it was quite difficult to figure out what was the difference, because we were working 70, 80, 90 hours a week and we were
Hmm.
happy. And then we actually figured out that one of the key components of the success of an organization is whether people were happy at what they were doing. And that's how we actually came up with this concept of cheerleadership, which is that the ultimate role of the manager is not to be a slave driver, but it's to make sure that people are happy at what they are doing. And the utmost responsibility of a manager is also to make sure to understand that sometimes the person might be his most brilliant person in the team, that he really needs him as an asset. However, that person is not happy for many, many, many reasons. And it's our job as managers to make sure that we help that person to be happy first.
Hmm.
Because happy people will produce results. Unhappy people will ruin their health and will not feel right. And I think that's one of the key learnings. In the meantime, because the cheerleader concept is almost 10 years old now, in the meantime, Gen Zs are actually just designed for that. They need to have values, and they need to have their own values in line with the values of the company that they work for. And that means they're only going to have to work with the company if they're happy. So that's really one of the key concepts there. That's cheerleadership.
Thank you. Thank you for elaborating more details on this concept. And thank you for being with us today, Jean-Luc, and it's been pleasure having you today.
Thank you. It was really a pleasure being able to share that. And as we said earlier in the preparation call, if viewers in the future actually have questions, they can drop a note actually on the YouTube link or on the Vimeo link where actually this video is going to be, and for sure, one of us will answer that question. So thank you very much for
Yes,
listening. Take
definitely.
care.
Thank you, Jean-Luc, and thank you for everyone attended today. Thank you.
Bye bye. Take care.
Right. Thank you.